translated with deepl.com. Disclaimer: this is an unofficial translation. This is from Seti number 108, page 1 to 18.
Excerpts from the 711th Official Contact Report of the 8th of October 2018.
That would certainly be so, because as with many other things, the majority of the Earthmen are not accessible to reason, but only to confused faith in relation to deception, lies, defamations and religious-sectarian delusion, and consequently real reality. Well-founded knowledge and material truth can only be perceived contrary to understanding and reason, as everything can neither be considered nor grasped, but misunderstood and therefore not comprehended. This is also the result, as I have to recognize again and again in my observations of the Earthmen, because warnings and explanations are not effectively perceived with interest, and also not registered, as well as not understood, but is a rule only counter-interpreted due to missing considerations.
I can also sing a song about this, because many Earthlings who react in this way think they are cleverer and smarter than these are the effective reality and its truth, whereby they want to be intelligent and also clever, but do not recognize how simple-minded and stupid they expose themselves, and by all their behavior and actions they organize a show of ridicule. But then I would now like to address something else, which is again and again mentioned by different people, namely why you Plejars have been holding back yourselves since ancient times, and have always maintained no direct, but only indirect, and besides only one-sided impulsive contacts to Earthlings, and also today will not maintain any direct contacts, as also in the future you will also maintain this since ancient times, also with regard to strangers to Earth and the Earth of the future. Also the question arises again and again why I had to stand as a middleman between the USA and you in order to seek your request to make contact with the US government, which also had to go through the elders. Also, if a contact had been made, I would have had to remain your middleman, because you would have acted only in this way. Although I know about the effective backgrounds in which the sphere of that time is integrated, which more than 52,000 years ago in your Plejaren system was orbited around all inhabited planets for 32 days each, after which all humans became peaceful, I think that you could explain everything from your side in order to create clarity in this respect as well.
You can explain that too, especially in the area of the core group and the passive group, because you know the facts well enough.
I do, but I think it would be good if you would do what I have my reasons for doing.
You're going to challenge me today. But well, then I want to satisfy your opinion and at least take up and disclose the important facts. But first I want to tell you about what you asked me about a long time ago, namely what it was about Lake Sonura and the dwarf creatures. As you said, I could find in my father's Ptaah annals records of it, which also showed facts that were completely alien to me and very interesting. According to his annals, he explored the earth at many times in the past, and almost 40,000 years ago he also came across Lake Sonura, where the elevated area above today's center was inhabited by small people who had an average size of 115 centimeters and were the most distant descendants of the first earthly hominids. In addition to these small people, some of whose most distant descendants are still to be found in Africa as pygmies, but also in Asia, my father Ptaah also researched their origins, which led him to many other regions of the world, where he came across various smaller groups of small people in Europe, Africa, South and North America, Australia and Asia. However, these were all different and up to 160 centimeters in size, had different pigments and anatomical differences. Interested, he continued his research into the past of the Earth's history and humanity and fathomed the developmental process of the hominids that had gone back to the early times of 17 million years. After that he went back many more millions of years into the past, and about 45 million years ago in the area that is today Germany he came across the first life forms that developed into a form early on, from which the hominid development developed about 17 million years ago. and from which in the course of the further millions of years finally the small people developed. He discovered these life forms in the place where he was then also together with you to instruct you, where the actual origin of the human form of existence began, in the area you know as Grubmessel, near Darmstadt. My father's fath found this first development of the life form, which led to the development of the first hominid species, for the very first time there, after which over many millions of years from the descendants developing out of it, in the area known today as North Africa, the first human being effectively emerged, as well as at the same time also in areas which are called today Europe, South Africa, South and North America as well as Asia and Australia. So he fathomed that all the small people he had researched came into being at approximately the same time, and that these were the first and oldest human beings on Earth, completely contrary to the in truth false research results of today's earthly scientific anthropology, whose alleged knowledge is based only on incorrect and hypothetical or imaginary assertions. Thus, research in the past has shown that the very first effective people on Earth were small people who naturally emerged from the planet and its nature, fauna and flora themselves in various areas. So the origin of mankind on Earth was rightly found in Africa, as earthly anthropology correctly teaches, but not in the way it was conceived. For the early earthly history of mankind did not begin at the time calculated according to the earliest remains of the genus Homo in Africa, but millions of years much earlier. According to the researches of my father's fath, all previous finds on Earth concerning earliest hominids correspond only to bones of human beings, which had developed evolutionally from the first genus Homo and then from the small ones, and became of bigger growth, following from the dwarves, as you always call them, and because of which you have set up various artificial dwarf figures in the center, who were effectively the very first human beings created on Earth, who developed the larger normal-grown ones, who populate the world in today's present in an immense excess. However, it must also be clearly explained that the hominid development of the human species did not take place in a uniform manner, but took place in various temporal and spatial gradations, when about 17 million years ago the process of the actual becoming and the evolutionary adaptation of the Earth human phenotypic anatomy began in relation to the small growth of the first life form Earth human. However, these were normal-growing people with regard to their body size, and therefore not comparable with the small-growing or undergrowing of the small-growing people known on Earth today. This small stature results from various symptoms of various underlying diseases, which impair body growth and limb development, whereby it is misleadingly assumed by inexperienced earthlings that these small people are cognitively handicapped. This, however, corresponds to an error and misjudgment of an unparalleled kind, because these people, who are impaired by small stature, are usually absolutely normal and equal to the so-called normal stature, in no way behind the normal stature in terms of the development of consciousness, mind, reason and intelligence, and thus also of all cognitive as well as all physical abilities, and thus also in terms of reproduction. But as far as Lakes and Jura is concerned, as I explained earlier, it covered the whole area of Schmidrower Quarter T, Sitzberg and Boer Quarter HL, and the Pig area, and was therefore a very large lake. On the raised shore the area was inhabited, that is at an elevated position above the position where the centre stands today, where you call the respective terrains house pulpit and back pulpit. This while the today's centre is built directly at the place where there was a shore covered with Framites. Note, Billy, Framite sequels read, at the time of the existence of the lake, how these plants still grow today in the shore zones of waters, where you found the old shore bottom during excavations under the centre and at the shed, and also found Framites remains from that time. At another time, however, when my father visited Lakes and Jura some 29,800 years ago, he could no longer find it, so he fathomed what had happened, and through further visits to the past he discovered that the dam of Lakes and Jura had been torn open and washed away by severe earthquakes, below where the entrance to the Steinental now exists. And all that remains to be explained now is that my father at that time, according to his annals, remembered the olden doctrine, which you rewrote and reproduced in Canon 20, verse 1102. Consequently, he judged the area around the former Sonura Lake in the past about 29,800 years ago as ideal and as the hoof of the horse, and found that this must be the place of the sage, as he is already described in the ancient hymn. So he decided to make the level Arahat Athasota, mediating that one day, when he had to take over the task of your teaching, you should be conceived and born by parents who should have a direct connection to the area of the former lake. And on the other hand, it should also be that you too should become familiar with the whole region around the former Sonura Lake from a very young age, in order to one day build up a place at this place, in order to spread the teachings of truth, the teachings of the Spirit, the teachings of life for the whole earth world from there. And through the immeasurable help of the level Arahat Athasota, in spite of all the tremendous adversities, my father's fath's foretold lofty intentions were realized. And so today the center actually exists and works out into the whole world. These, Edward, my dear friend, are the facts from my father's infinite number of records of his annals, of which I have only become aware in the last few days, and can now also name them to you.
Legendary. I didn't know anything about all these things and happenings either. I just had the little information Sfoth needed to give me, so I knew where I was and what I had to do.
My father was really like that, because he only explained as much as was necessary. But we should not talk about that now, but about what concerns us Plejars. I must begin by addressing what happened about 52,000 years ago on Neera and our other Plejarian planets. At that time, the ball missile, which circled around Neera and also around the other Plejarian planets for 32 days each, emitted vibrations that controlled a certain brain region and an exactly defined area of all planet inhabitants, against which there was no possibility of defense, as could be fathomed by our scientists at that time. Our directives do not allow me to explain what the processes were and what brain areas and exact areas of the brain were involved, because by providing more precise information for the Earth people and their brain researchers, respectively, knowledge can be gained from them, which they then, as usual with the Earth scientists, when they gain new knowledge, would convert into new useful weapons for wars and secret services, and then misuse these for murder, destruction, torture and for warlike purposes. On the one hand, this would result from the neuroscientists, who would use everything in such a way to manipulate the structure and function of the nervous systems of terrestrial humans in such a way that they would be destroyed and inoperative. This would even wipe out whole peoples or simply make them suffering and ill, as for example through the widespread spreading and radiation of vibrations causing illnesses among the Earth people concerned, which are to be wiped out or harassed. Polyneuropathy and migraine, as well as neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's disease, autoimmunological diseases such as multiple sclerosis, could also be caused, as could craniocerebral trauma, strokes, cerebral hemorrhages, epilepsy, brain tumors and meningitis, etc., whereby treatment options and therapy alternatives would no longer be available for anything. In addition, diseases of consciousness such as insanity, idiocy and feeble-mindedness, etc., as well as incurable depression and psychological destruction, etc., would also be considered.
That would be more than just inhuman. But it would probably be appropriate to explain what happened to you Plejars more than 52,000 years ago, how and through what your peoples of all Plejar planets came to peace and freedom.
But that could actually degenerate into the way you said, which is why I can't consider any more details and explanations, and can't explain anything in more detail. However, I am allowed to explain what I want to do only in a short way and without any major explanations, what happened to our ancestors 52,000 years ago, but I really do not intend to go into detail. It turned out that the vibrational impulses emitted by the aforementioned ball flight device had a very effective influence on certain brain areas of all planet inhabitants, and had such an effect on special areas that all impulses of violence and degeneration were soothed, but not extinguished, but only put into a softened state and peacefully tuned. This was enough for the populations of all the planets to fall away from all malicious violence and become peaceful in their mood during the time when the ball aircraft was orbiting the worlds, while still retaining their free will and, above all, without external verbal influences from the state leaders and their unpeaceful propaganda, etc., becoming more and more attached to the mind and reason and beginning to think, decide and act independently. The soothing influences of vibrations, which only had an effect on certain areas of the brain, and in these only on special areas, were neither aggressive nor compelling, because only impulses of vibrations occurred which stimulated the mind and reason, and led to the populations discarding their collective world of thought within a few days, because they became free of all unsatisfactory suggestive collective thinking controlled by governments and religions, and were able to form their own independent thoughts and opinions. Through the very rapid abandonment of their collective thinking suggestively controlled by governments and religions, and the likewise very rapid learning and use of their own individual thoughts, the people of the Plejaren planets learned and grasped their personal self-knowledge and formed their own and ever stronger self-determination, whereby they attained a personal mental strength. In a special way, the apostasy and the abandonment of all religious faith factors had an effect, and with it the perception and knowledge of reality and the truth anchored in it grew, and with it the grasping, understanding and following of the natural creative laws, which are universally aligned to peacefulness, freedom and independence. When this was recognized by all Plejaren populations of all our worlds, and every religious belief was discarded and frowned upon, manifold insights were formed in the result of personal attitudes and far-reaching thought processes and certainties, which led to the fact that all people of all peoples set themselves independently challenging goals and adhered to them even under difficulties, learned to process failures better and well, gained a higher motivation, and achieved their set self-realization goals. It also turned out that within only 11 days they were less and less distracted by other people's opinions, and above all not by the suggestive and unpeaceful insinuations of the government, nor by their unhappiness. To the contrary, all the populations of all the planets as a whole henceforth made every effort and persevered to achieve their goals themselves. Very quickly they became aware of their own abilities and learned to control and master situations of any kind that arose just as quickly. They quickly became mentally strong persons who also learned to use their abilities by constantly seeking, finding and realizing new challenges for their mind and reason as well as for their self-development and self-realization. In this way, individuals learned to cope with stress and strain within a very short time, and to live their entire self-created personality traits in a controlled manner. Through their ever-growing mental strength, they very quickly created a conscious performance that also had a strong impact on their mental and physical health, as well as on setting and achieving new and challenging goals for themselves. And all this, along with many other positive developments, ultimately led within only 32 days, during which the ball aircraft circled the worlds, to all persons of all populations finally liberating themselves independently and according to their own free will from all degeneracies and from all violence and immorality, etc. Through the unimaginably strong evolutive impulses of vibration which were emitted by the ballistic missile and which influenced the humanities of all our Plejaren planets, within a very short time all human beings became aware that external influences by other persons, forces and populist and unpeaceful anti-peace, degenerate, violent and destructive influences, negative and malicious influences which were controlled by the governments and which affected the mind and the reason as well as negatively influenced them against their own will and caused them to fall into violence, etc., took place within a very short time. This realization led the people of all our planets to renounce violence, immorality, degeneracy, evil and bad, and also to defeat their bad habits. But it was also recognized that in spite of all knowledge and efforts regarding the way of life in the good, right, human and in relation to righteousness, as well as regarding the observance of the natural positive creative laws, man always remains susceptible and can fall back into old bad, negative, evil and bad behaviors, if he does not strive for the necessary control for contraception. And it was recognized that this can happen again and again, if in this connection in any verbal, physical or consciousness, thought, emotion and situation and forms long enough from the outside on the human being is affected. So in this respect all people of all Plejaren planets or their populations were classified in this natural creative law of action in such a way that countermeasures had to be taken, which were recorded and followed in directives, and which consisted in the fact that no direct or otherwise harmful connections to foreign worlds and their populations were to be sought and maintained, so as not to fall back into the old ways of behaving through such contacts with foreign peoples and peoples who were not our ancestors. We Plejars of today, like our ancestors 52,000 years ago and all descendants since then, are human beings too, who must resist such external influences unscathed, for unfortunately we are still susceptible to negative external influences which would let us fall back into the old ways of behaving if we were long enough into negative spheres of influence which are harmful to us and if we were hit by factors which have a negative effect on us. We Plejars, too, are human beings and are categorized as developing within the framework of every natural creative order and law, through a very laborious elaboration of our higher evolution of consciousness, which we must follow and continue to learn even after 52,000 years of peace. And we can do this today through the life teaching of Endymion, the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, which helps us unspeakably much in our further evolution of consciousness, but which was known to us only in small parts until the beginning of your mission, but which you now bring and teach not only to the terrestrial human beings, but also to us in many extended explanations. But as for our ancestors more than 52,000 years ago, it was only at that time that they gained their knowledge and became aware of the effective facts and values of living according to the natural creative laws, when the ballistic missile appeared and circled around our Plejaren planets, all the Plejaren populations being struck by its vibratory impulses and soothed and peacefully tuned in a restrained, yet determined and effective manner. These vibratory impulses stimulated their minds and reason, and the populations turned to the gently pressing peaceful impulses and consciously learned to surrender to their evolution of consciousness. Through this devotion our ancestors at that time recognized the truth and effectiveness of the natural creative laws and correct natural creative way of life, learned to fathom and follow them and made them their own, so that from then on all populations consciously developed according to them and aligned themselves to them in every way. But they were only able to do the whole thing after they realized that their entire very high technical development in all forms and possibilities with regard to peace, real freedom, righteousness, justice and humanity, as well as their way of life according to natural creative laws, did not bring them away from their degenerations, their violent behavior and from all evil, from all warfare and all destructive and all negative and all evil behavior. Only through the effect of the vibration impulses on them, which were emitted by the ball-flying apparatus and which influenced them peacefully, did they find their personal change and finally, through their own development of consciousness, knowledge, efforts, their own will, their mind, their reason and use of their intelligence, they arrived at their personal inner peace, their personal inner freedom and righteousness. And this invaluable gain and victory over themselves they also began to show to the outside world, whereby all peoples united among themselves in a continuing state of peace and freedom, and since then all acts of violence, degenerations and wars etc. have become a thing of the past. As a fact, however, it must be repeated that all acts of violence, wars, hatred and falsehood, discord, bondage and injustice, injustice and degeneracy, etc., are to be considered as a single act. Could only be ended in any form when the vibrational impulses of the ball glider had an effect on all Plejaren peoples and soothed them peacefully, thus making them consciously powerful of their own independent and externally uninfluenced faculty of thought as well as of their intellect, reason and the application of their intelligence, and thus enabling their own self-development to take place. This did not mean, however, that our ancestors 52,000 years ago or since then had been superior to any susceptibility and recidivism to the old degenerate, malicious, warlike, violent and all other negative forms, and disregarding all natural creative laws of disregard. And this is also not the case today, because we Plejars today are not yet immune to it, just as all our ancestors were not. This is well known to us Plejars, and we also know through the teachings of Endymion that in order to be above all susceptibility and recidivism in the old negative patterns of degeneration, violence, war, hatred, falsehood and malice, etc., man needs much more than just change to peace, freedom, justice and righteousness, etc., and that everything cannot simply be worked out through normal development in terms of understanding, reason, intelligence and knowledge. But this very much more is only possible for a human being, no matter who, how, what and where he is from, whether from the Earth, from our Plejar planets or elsewhere, if he learns very thoroughly and intensively over all times to perceive reality and the truth it contains and to implement all resulting insights for his own and self-development in a correctly positive and evolutive way. And the comprehensive knowledge that gradually matured in all the people of our Plejarian populations also led to the realization that all becoming requires all natural creative flourishing of long periods of time, which in this regard led all Plejarian peoples to understand that they would never cease learning, but would have to learn their whole lives and continue to learn, because learning would never cease, but would continue endlessly and also in each new life in relation to each new personality. So it became clear and understandable that learning never ends and therefore must be continued in every new life of every new personality, for many millennia and millions of years, up to the one-time entrance into the higher levels of the High Council and higher. But this meant, and this was recognized in the course of time, that man must learn endlessly throughout all times in which he incarnates again and again as new personalities and exists and lives as a material form of life and must continue to learn, which is why as a learning man he will never be immune to making mistakes again and again in order to learn from them and to understand everything better and to continue learning positively. But this was also associated with the realization that, as a result of the lifelong learning process of each new personality, there was also the danger and possibility of all new incarnations and new personalities being timelessly exposed to the danger and possibility of falling back into the old behavior of former personalities, despite every higher development achieved. But it was recognized that especially suggestive verbal, thought and emotional influences, as well as consciousness and psych disorders, and various external influences of fellow human beings can cause very negative recidivism with regard to all kinds of behavior. And this realization that such external influences of fellow human beings have a suggestive effect, and that they provoke relapses into old negative ways of acting and patterns and ultimately cause them to be conjured up and broken through, led to the creation of directives that warned against and prohibited them, that from then on no more extraplanetary contacts and connections with peoples or individual forms of life were to be cultivated in any way whatsoever, whose state of evolution in terms of life and behavior as well as the rationality of consciousness, thought, feeling, psychology, action and reason were lower than the general average of the Plejarian population in this respect. And these directives have survived throughout all times up to the present day and are therefore still valid today and in the distant future. This is because it has been known to us for 52,000 years through the teachings of Endymion, which you transmit to our humanity as well as to humanity on Earth, that through the most diverse external suggestive or any other negative influences the susceptibility to relapses into old negative patterns and norms is always given to all human beings in universal vastness, because we players, too, would be disadvantaged by such energies and forces acting on us and could fall back into old behavior patterns. However, we must protect ourselves against this, whereby we act in this respect in accordance with our directives, comply with them unswervingly in observance and compliance, and therefore run no risk of suffering any damage. Through the teaching of Endymion, which should teach us, we now also know that man is susceptible to setbacks and relapses into old negative forms of old behavior for so long that he no longer needs his material body, which will only be when his spiritual form enters the higher level of high advice. Only then has the human consciousness reached a higher evolutionary level and can profit from it and profitably perceive, apply and effectively implement the always positive impulses from the spiritual form in the consciousness. If this is not the case, there is always the possibility of danger with regard to susceptibility and recidivism to old negative mentalities and behaviors, etc., which is why it is always necessary to fight against this and consciously control everything so that falling back into the old degenerate patterns is avoided. And this danger of relapse exists in any case always and with every human being, if he is influenced suggestively from the outside in his consciousness, his mind, his reason and intelligence, etc., and if his spiritual form is not yet sufficiently highly evolutionated. But this is also given with us Plejars in this way, because our consciousness and mind, our reason and intelligence, due to a lack of a sufficiently high evolution of consciousness, are still susceptible to degenerated external influences of every possible kind, whereby in particular linguistic and action-related influences from outside and behavioral patterns of people that have a direct effect on us are such that they have a negative effect on us and could throw us back into the old degenerations and effects that were still peculiar to our ancestors 52,000 years ago, and from which we still have to protect ourselves today and very far into the future. In this respect, even our highly developed technology of every kind cannot protect us, as we can only use it in many different ways for ourselves, while we are dependent in every respect on our intellect, our reason, intelligence and directives with regard to our evolution, mentality and all our behaviors, in order to preserve and not endanger the high life values of every kind which are continuously further developed by our ancestors and ourselves. And this corresponds to a thing which may seem incomprehensible to the majority of mankind on earth, as well as to the fact that we cannot and must not get involved in any direct or other contacts and connections with life forms that think differently and live differently, or with people like man on earth, on the basis of these reasons. This fact is therefore one of the most important reasons why we Plejarians should refrain from entering into direct or telepathic contacts with people and peoples of other worlds, in accordance with our security and the directives we have created in this regard, as well as in any technical or communicative form. This is precisely the case when in their forms of mentality and behavior as well as in their way of life and in their use of understanding, reason and intelligence, etc. they are not aligned with our Plejarian values, but are degenerate to the contrary and violent and criminally deficient with regard to righteousness and the observance of natural creative laws, etc., as is the case with humanity on earth, where very few exceptions can be found, which, although not extensive, at least in part, learn to strive for a better, positive and naturally creative correct way of life. But the mentioned negative factors, as these are given with the Earth people, also occur with the strangers to Earth and the third grouping and with the Earth futures, who on the one hand already for thousands of years or for other quite some time on Earth again and again show their presence in different ways. These explanations should suffice, because they have clarified the most important facts.
Your father's Fath already explained all this to me, as did you, your daughter Simisa, Quetzal and Asit, but I thought that the whole thing should be explained openly in a conversation by you, which you did now. Thank you very much for that, Ptaah. Your explanation will certainly help some Earthlings to understand why you have been able to hold back strictly, for example by not getting directly involved in any connections with an earthly government, but only through my intermediary. And why the whole thing with regard to the attempt to establish indirect contact with the US government via me could not come about in this way. You have also clarified this and established that an unfair business was pulled through, which deterred you and led to the realization that an honest contact attempt with the Earthlings is impossible. Already your first contact attempt with an earthly government, just with the USA, was thought through my mediation and should be brought about by the person assigned by me for it, whereby however unfortunately everything was condemned from the outset by lies and fraud to failure. Also in this respect it was and is to be said that honesty cannot lead to success through lies and deceit, but only through effective honesty itself, which can only lead to something valuable and lasting from a natural creative point of view. Here, too, reality and truth are all fundamental values, although many earthlings manipulate or try to shape reality and its truth for their own benefit and advantage, depending on their mood and desire, often making many things impossible and destroying them. On the one hand, reality and truth cannot be separated because they form a unity, and on the other hand, there is no understanding of what reality and truth really mean, which is why I would like to express in our conversation what is to be understood by them. I find this necessary, because since time immemorial many philosophers, like for example Aristotle, Democritus, Friedrich Nietzsche, René Copyright Descartes, Confucius, Petrus Abelardus, Francis Bacon, Kant and Hegel and many others wise, the concept of truth has never really been defined, but has only been made embarrassingly incomprehensible with nonsensical attempts at explanation, and even today is still made misleading and incomprehensible with nonsensical attempts at explanation. This has also happened in many other ways, such as dialectical materialism, American pragmatism and subjective idealism, consensus theory, pragmatic truth and the coherence theory of truth, etc., where a distinction is made between a predicative and an attributive concept of truth, etc. So I think that I will give a clear explanation of what you Plejars understand by the term truth, just as I learned it from your father's Thoth teaching, and hope that I can still correctly reproduce it as he taught me, and therefore the term truth can only be defined in such a way that it becomes comprehensible what is to be understood by the value of truth.
Truth founded in the perception and cognition of reality, and thus in the reflection of it, because the truth anchored in reality, which alone is true to reality, corresponds to an absolute agreement in logical consistency and proves the authenticity, purity and correctness of real reality, which as such has no possibility of doubt, in all respects related to an effectively real, true fact or truth. An irrefutable fact of a statement, assertion, existential existence, fact, event, action, speech, emotion, situation, thing, act, presence, event or behavior which has taken place, exists, has taken place, is made, is present or will take place in the future, etc.
My presentation did not go far, because if I had had to explain everything in more detail, there would not have been enough time today. And as for your explanation of the concept of truth, I must say that you were an unusually good disciple of my father, and your memory leaves nothing to be desired, as you sometimes say on certain occasions.
Wasn't necessary and didn't have to be, because what you explained is fully sufficient and shows what was at that time when peace came to your peoples, and why you Plejars in every way hold back from contacts with earthlings, strangers to the earth and future earthlings. And I think that according to your directives you are also holding back with other planetary nations that do not belong to your federation and that cannot be classified into your development and behavior scheme, etc. What you say about my memory, however, is not generally so, because after my health collapse and my partial amnesia I forgot much of my personal life story and did not refresh it. What was important for me was basically only related to my mission work, which is why I only reworked all the necessary knowledge in this respect, which alone cost me a great deal of effort. But if I also had to get my life story back on track, then I would have failed miserably because everything would have been too much and I could no longer do my job today.
What you think and say is actually our directives and our behavior.
But what would certainly be necessary to explain is probably why humanity on Earth lives in degenerations of violence, murder and manslaughter, torture, coercion, wars, revolutions, terrorism, rape, destruction, and with lies, deception, hatred, discord, lack of freedom, injustice and slander, etc., etc. The whole thing related to this is in principle not only a matter of the degeneration of individual earthlings, and also not only with regard to the absolute majority of the people of the earth, but in reality the case with 99.6% of the entire Earth population, as your father Svath already told me after the end of the World War, when he explained to me the cause of the whole evil of the people of the earth, which is not of normal natural creative nature, but was created by man himself and genetically endlessly handed down since primeval times, has been passed on from generation to generation and will continue to be passed on in the future. And this is unfortunately the case that man, and by this I mean now especially the earthling, as I learned from Svath and you, was degenerated by his own actions. It must be clear, however, that in the vastness of the universe there are also other humanities and forms of life, which are equally ill in the head and live with degenerations of all kinds, unpeaceful and unrighteous, and therefore also make their existence hell by their own actions in a similar or the same way as the earthlings. And as Svath said, it may be said that the absolute majority of all human and man-like creatures in our entire universe have thus, by their own early degenerations, fallen into a converging state with that of degenerated earth humanity. But this can one day lead to enormous unpleasantness, and even to acts of war with extraterrestrials, and to the danger of the extermination or enslavement of humanity on Earth, as well as to the annexation of the Earth by aliens. And it is precisely in this respect that crazy earthlings, who do not have understanding, reason and intelligence for assent, have done everything with the Seti project so that it can possibly happen when the Seti probe is found by aliens from Earth. Through this crazy project, aliens should be made aware of the Earth and this contact should be sought. And what it all has to do with it, I have here in this expression from Wikipedia.
SETI at Home is a volunteer computing project at the University of Berkeley that focuses on the search for extraterrestrial intelligent life. Search for extraterrestrial intelligence. SETI refers to the search for extraterrestrial civilizations. Since 1960, various scientific projects have been carried out which, among other things, investigate the radio range of the electromagnetic spectrum for possible signs and signals of technical civilizations in space. Basics and estimates. SETI research is based on the assumption that extraterrestrial cultures exist in space and use communication systems and communication technologies similar to those on Earth. So far it is not known whether extraterrestrial life exists or whether there are other technical civilizations capable of transmitting and receiving interstellar signals. The astronomer Frank Drake has tried to estimate this with the Drake equation. If the factors of this equation are assessed optimistically, a possible number of more than 300 such civilizations in the Milky Way can be identified. In 1964, Stephen Dole conducted the first estimation of the number of possible habitable worlds in the galaxy in a study for the RAND Corporation. With the Kardashev scale, possible technical possibilities of extraterrestrial civilizations are estimated. The galaxy in which the Earth is located, the Milky Way, has a diameter of approximately 100,000 light-years and contains between 200 and 400 billion stars and, according to Kepler's mission findings, -50 billion planets, of which an estimated 500 million are planets in habitable zones. Further analyses of the Kepler data and investigations with the Keck telescope as of 2013 indicate an even higher number of planets in habitable zones within the Milky Way.
But all this is actually just a side note, because I wanted to explain what Svath taught me regarding the evil, of which the 99.6% of the Earthlings have been hereditarily controlled since time immemorial, thereby causing catastrophes over catastrophes and disaster over disaster, and slowly destroying the entire nature, its fauna and flora, and also the planet through their delusion of overpopulation, which is growing further and further. And with regard to all the degenerates that dominate the Earthling, or the human being of the Earth, Sfath explained to me that this evil had been expressed genetically in man as degenerations in ancient times, through his own guilt. I have learnt from your father that various factors play a very important role in the development of degenerations in man. However, man is not simply helplessly at the mercy of these factors, but can bring them under control by reason, intelligence, and at his own discretion, and control his life and lead it in peace, freedom, love, righteousness, balance, helpfulness, and according to natural and creative laws. So he is not forced to do something degenerate or evil, because basically he can determine himself by mind, reason, intelligence, and his own will, etc., how he wants to do something and what he wants to do or not, both in good and in evil, or in negative and positive. Exactly this fact, however, the earthling does not take note of due to disinterest and mental laziness. Consequently, he does not make any effort whatsoever to make something useful out of himself, just a human being, to whom effective humanity respectively a true human being is peculiar. Even easy to grasp and understand, everything good, love, right, valuable, and every right behavior can be explained to him according to natural creative order and law. But every word of every explanation echoes unheard like a breath of wind in the desert that is barely audible. The traditional genetic burden of man with regard to the degenerate, inhuman, unkind, evil, violent, murderous, overpopulating, rapist, tortuous, liarous, deceptive and slanderous, as well as the warlike, terrorist, false and all-around destructive has become so characteristic and self-evident for the earthling that he feels soaked in it and is satisfied with it. But where and what is hidden as a secret behind everything, namely how and where everything is created in the brain, does not concern man as much as what causes all degenerations in the good as in the bad, or in the negative and positive to arise in all manifold forms. So man is not interested in the fact that, depending on the kind, everything emerges from consciousness as the finest and harmless breath of an idea and a thought arising from it, whereby the actual origin is founded in the frontal lobe of the brain, as is nevertheless the case in the so-called paired core area of the brain, or in the medial part of the respective temporal lobe, where the stimulus-reaction center is located, in which good or bad or negative or positive emotional effects are created by the feelings arising from thoughts. And this happens by thought-feeling influences, which are caused by environmental conditions and all kinds of external influences, fellow human beings and their machinations and other influences, etc., as well as by the blood sugar content of the human being, which influences and even controls the function of the stimulus-reaction center in an important way. The truth in this regard is that the higher the blood sugar level, the more inclined man is to peace, love, balance, righteousness and altruism, the more consciously he deals with freedom and justice and is connected with it, whereas in the other case, precisely when man lives in the trap of his degenerations and reproduces them deliberately or unintentionally through his evil and negative behavior, he has a below-average low blood sugar content. But this has nothing to do with the fact, as Sfath taught me, that humans can directly inject their blood sugar content into the blood through a large oral intake of sugar or through sugar injections and therefore become better, more peaceful and more selfless. Because according to the explanation of Sfath, a certain substance in the blood sugar is the decisive factor which causes a corresponding reaction in the stimulus-reaction center. I can't remember the name of the substance, but it shouldn't be particularly important, whereas the fact, as Sfath said, that this blood sugar substance is influenced by thoughts and feelings and causes a correspondingly important reaction in the stimulus-reaction center. This also means that even if a person eats a lot of sweets and wants to let his blood sugar rise, but lives without good, valuable, positive, loving, peaceful and free emotions regarding his thoughts and the resulting feelings, he cannot produce the corresponding blood sugar substance, and the missing substance can neither be created nor used by the stimulus reaction center. But it must also be said that the thoughts and feelings generate the actual neurophysiological reactions in the brain, whereby the truth is basically that these can only take place in the stimulus reaction center, although man can influence this center very difficult. But if he nevertheless wants to influence it and bring it under his conscious control, then he must in every respect become master of himself and over all his emotions, and thus also a true human being, which, however, does not only require years of intensive, serious and painful learning as well as abstinence and bearing of often malicious unpleasantness. The whole thing requires a learning and career rich in privation for decades, through which everything must be regulated that has been formed in man since the earliest primeval times in degenerate form and genetically conditioned up to the present time, and will continue to be inherited into the distant future. Effectively, the degenerations are anchored in every single person of the earth, following which everyone is burdened with the legacy of a profound intrusion, which corresponds to an original degenerative development, through which unconsciously the recollection and re-experience of psychotraumatic events, and thus the degenerations of all kinds created in primeval times, are subconsciously drilling or superficially pushing. But last but not least, effective active outbreaks can occur in different ways, be it verbally or through indirect or direct degeneration forms according to corresponding negative or positive proliferating behaviors. Now I have again digressed a little from what still has to be said with regard to the stimulus reaction center, because it works, according to the explanations of Sfath, with the faulty impulses, which emanate from the frontal lobe, whereby not only the stimulus reaction increases, but also its energy and its power, which express themselves negatively or positively in the human being, because fundamentally and by nature both factors are given. It is then only a matter of what man uses of these two energies and forces, whether in a positive or negative way, but as a rule the negative prevails and is simply let run and allowed to break through, because, as the old proverb says, the path of least resistance is the easiest and is therefore chosen and followed. As a result, the thoughts that arise and break out of consciousness and the feelings that result from them are not controlled in any way, but are simply allowed to run wild, constantly increasing, until they become enormous power and finally, negatively or positively, break out. Then it happens in a negative way, and the negative has been predominant since time immemorial, that not reactions of joy, love, peace, justice and righteousness become overpowering, but fear, hatred, vindictiveness, discord, injustice and lack of freedom, violence, coercion and no longer tameable anger. This ultimately leads to an outbreak and to the execution of malicious and uncontrollable degenerations, including misanthropy. Wikipedia, Greek, a circumflex microsine I circumflex superscript 1 I diaresis function symbol I circumflex microsine A acute dash I circumflex 1/2 messian hate, reject, and A acute 1/4 I circumflex 1/2 I circumflex sedia E per thousand euro E I diaresis A tilde anthroposman, which corresponds to the view and action of a human being who hates people, who becomes a murderer, killer or mass murderer, or at least rejects their proximity. Such a person may become a misanthropist or a misanthropist and an enemy of man, for whom there is no longer any thought-feeling impulse for his fellow human beings, and as a result he will act without hesitation and uncontrolled in the same way as torture, rape, mass murder and especially in wars in which human beings especially live out their degenerations. But in contrast to the misanthropist stands the altruist, who is a philanthropist and selfless, unselfish human being, who is able to keep himself largely free from his degenerations inherited from time immemorial through control, self-discipline and humanity, which in any case is only due to time and situation. The reason for this is that, Despite all altruistic efforts and control with regard to oneself, one's thoughts and feelings as well as one's behavior remain susceptible to the degenerations inherited from him, which can be broken unexpectedly by some nasty internal or external influences and circumstances, whereby, as I already mentioned, the most important thing is always the disastrous, the fatal, the perishable, the devastating, the horrible, the ungracious, the evil, the precarious, the arch and the bad, the negative and the angry, the destructive and, I would say, the mephistophel. And that evil is usually expressed and broken out. This is especially the case in humans when they have special physical characteristics, such as a diminished function of the autonomous nervous system. It is responsible for the regulation of the heartbeat, as well as for respiration, blood pressure, digestion, metabolism, sexual organs, perspiration and the eye muscles. Thoughts and the resulting feelings in the psyche influenced by them play a very important role in what is particularly recognizable and noticeable in anger, fear, hate, unhappiness and rage. If the autonomic nervous system is impaired, this has an extreme effect on the heartbeat of the human being and also on his blood pressure and thus also on his degenerations. This is because if the heartbeat has a slowed down function and the blood pressure is balanced at a low value, an urge for activity arises, in which the way to the urge to act or to the blood pressure is not as easy as in the case of the heartbeat. Activism as a rule leads the closest via the path of least resistance, that is via the underground workings of the degenerations pushing into the foreground and their breakout. If this circumstance actually occurs, then the entire nervous system is overloaded, and this leads to explosion, that is then the degenerations prevailing deep inside force their way out, come to an outbreak in species, namely as a result of the traditional inheritance of the degenerations, in a vicious, angry verbalism or in violent actions in relation to violence, murder and manslaughter, torture, rape and terror as well as various inhuman behaviors. So, fundamentally, I have to say because I have to explain in more detail that the frontal lobe and the stimulus reaction center are the basic factors of origin in the human brain in which everything begins to act. First, the whole thing of each degeneration happens as an inconspicuous idea and a thought resulting from it, from which words or actions manifest themselves according to the personal impulses, ideas, fantasies and desires etc. according to one's own will, evenly formed in good or bad that is negative or positive way. This means that man no longer sees himself in this way, but only as an active part of society, humanity or a group whose rules, laws, orders etc. and the resulting behavior become his own in every respect. Consequently, his very own individuality is thereby extinguished and he becomes, without hesitation, will or responsibility, the tool of what has a suggestive, good, evil, positive or negative effect on him from outside, be it from society, from individual fellow human beings, a group, society or the whole of humanity, as well as through bondage, politics or religious and sectarian delusions of faith, military machinations, terrorism, philosophy or sciences, etc., all of which trigger stimulus reactions in man. So the frontal lobe and the stimulus reaction center are the basic factors of origin in the human brain in which everything begins to act. First, this happens as an inconspicuous idea and a thought resulting from it, from which words or actions manifest themselves according to one's own will, depending on one's personal impulses, ideas, fantasies and desires etc., depending on whether they are formed in a good or bad or negative or positive way. The whole thing, however, first develops in a subterranean, still unknown to man, somehow secret, unofficial, and I would like to say sterile form and in an impersonal way, and then everything happens in such a way, as if it is not something that concerns the person concerned himself. Explained differently, I want to say that first of all he does not recognize the whole as his very own product, and therefore does not accept it as such, but, when he becomes aware of it, sees it as a work of art of events and situations, and as a product and result of the machinations of fellow human beings and the environment. In this way, however, he loses his independence and connects himself with his fellow men and society, as well as with all their machinations, be it in relation to views, hypotheses, impulses of all kinds, such as hatred, lies, violence, torture, slander, words, actions and all other forms of behavior. This means that man no longer sees himself in this way, but only as a segment of society, of humanity or of a group, whose rules, laws, orders etc. and their resulting behavior become his own in every respect. Consequently, his very own individuality is thereby extinguished and he becomes, without hesitation, will and responsibility, the tool of what has a suggestive, good, evil, positive or negative effect on him from outside, be it from society, from individual fellow human beings, from a group, through bondage, through politics or religious and sectarian delusions of faith, military machinations, terrorism, philosophy or sciences, etc., all of which trigger stimulus reactions in man.
There is probably nothing more to discuss about your execution and your explanations, because what my father taught you about everything you also learned and what you explained should suffice. But you have mentioned the term Mephistophel, which I do not know despite knowing your mother tongue and also the German language, so I think that this word is one that you have created yourself, just as you create new words and concepts again and again elsewhere. Mephistopheles or Mephisto is known to me as the name of the or a devil in the fist cloth, which is why I assume that your new term refers to the devilish.
Yeah, but it's not hard to guess. Faust, however, is a servant spirit who is called for assistance, or as Paredros, that is observer, and spiritus familiaris, that is good house spirit, or confidant of the family, who was magically forced to come and who, according to his name, was regarded or accepted by Faust as the personified conscience.
You should name the frontal lobe with today's earthly technical term.
I don't know what he's called.
The term is frontal cortex.
Thanks, but I think about everything I've said, that only a few earthlings are really interested in it and will think about how it has always been and will always be.
With regard to many things and factors, the majority of terrestrial human beings are not accessible to understanding and reason, but only to confused faith, knowledge and truth that follow are not observed, not considered, not understood in a way that is contrary to understanding and reason. This also happens, as I have to recognize again and again in my observations of the Earthmen, because warnings and explanations are not really perceived and consequently also as a rule due to missing considerations effectively misunderstood and then also unrealistically interpreted.
Yes, and unfortunately I have had a lot of experience in this respect, because everything is based on the fact that on the one hand you don't really listen and therefore you can't think about it if you explain any facts, things, situations, happenings or occurrences etc. Therefore, the rule is that if I repeat it, as a result of not realizing, not thinking and not thinking about what is offered, everything is taken in the wrong way and therefore automatically an immediate rejection and a countering takes place. Inevitably, this leads to misunderstandings that could usually be prevented if something mentioned, said and exposed were first thought about instead of simply being answered and countered in a confused manner. On the other hand, it is also the case that explanations, warnings and all kinds of information that are given, for example to the public media etc., in order to make them known to the public, are simply left unanswered and consequently concealed from human society. But the warning people are insulted as idiots, do-gooders, liars, deceivers, swindlers and idiots, as was done about me in the 1940s and 1950s, and also in later years, when I tried to carry predictions etc. to the public. Everything was just ridiculed and destroyed, including all the predictions listed in the book Prophecies and Predictions, which I sent to many public media and governments, etc. And all the prophecies and predictions from the 1940s and 1950s, and also from all later years, are now fulfilled in a terrible way. This is because prophecies and predictions are not listened to, and humanity on earth continues to be criminally bred, through whose likewise criminal machinations nature and its fauna and flora, the climate and the waters were largely destroyed, many forms of life were irrevocably exterminated, and the planet itself was enormously harassed. To list the individual predictions again is probably absolutely pointless, because they have been described by me many times in various letters, bulletins and books, and have been spread in the earth world. But from it and from all the trouble no valuable resonance resulted, by which all bad things could have been avoided, which belong today in all the world as natural disasters, suffering, misery, wars, crimes and various evils to the agenda, and in the future will become even much worse. Through my prophecies and the various predictions I have pointed out again and again since the 1940s, and to this day, what will happen in the future, and therefore also in the present time, just as it actually happens today in the whole world, but still everything is not listened to, but made ridiculous, just as also everything of my predictions is concealed from the public media of all kinds. Furthermore, and I should mention this, the media, if they already mention any special things, on the one hand distorts everything according to their own interpretations, distorts it and often even reproduces it lyingly and slanderously. This, while on the other hand also the statistics, which are provided, are based only on assumptions and suppositions and on wrong calculations, because the statisticians have no possibility to really fathom, grasp and evaluate the effective facts and facts, like among other things in relation to the effective number of the entire terrestrial mankind, whereby they calculate, for example, at present in October 2018 the world population with approximately 7.63 billion humans. And these false conjecture calculations stand in contrast to your very precise data, which you play years show according to your annual counts, and which on the 31st of December 2017 listed the earthly world population with 8,844,128,002, 8,844,128,002 earthly men, thus far more than the earthly statisticians therefore fabulate. The annual increase in the Earth's human population, which has been between 100 and 110 million people for years, is also played down by the statisticians, but the UN also makes false growth forecasts within the same framework, because it expects a population growth of around 78 million people per year for the period 2015 to 2020, with the United Nations expecting around 9.7 billion people on the globe by 2050. But this corresponds to pathologically erroneous and confusing assertions, which deviate far from reality and truth, because effectively the world population is growing to a much greater extent than the Schlauen statisticians and other Schlauen can imagine and claim, when they talk about the world population shite and stupidly palavern stupidly. In truth, they do not even have a small idea of what corresponds to the reality and truth of the whole with regard to overpopulation, nor do they have a clue about its real growth and its worldwide destructive manifold machinations, such as the destruction of nature, the poisoning and extermination of fauna and flora, the dangerous changing influences on the atmosphere and climate, the poisoning and pollution of the seas, fresh waters, and the cultivation of food for all life, just like humans, animals and vertebrates, etc. Nor do these bigoted professionals think about it, like all other responsible people in the world, who only spit out big tones, make stupid speeches, and are as clever as they come, but in reality are as stupid as bean straw, that by the destructive machinations triggered by overpopulation and becoming more and more blatant, everything is inexorably destroyed and wiped out more and more. The fact is that the overpopulation and its all-destructive machinations not only drive nature, fauna and flora, the entire environment and all seas and fresh waters, but also mankind itself into ruin, misery and catastrophe, which slowly but surely does everything to exterminate itself. And the statisticians lie diligently that there are fewer and fewer births, whereby the huge annual increase of the world population is played down and denied, and this because perhaps in Switzerland and in Germany the number of births has decreased somewhat, but this does not refer to the whole world. It is also generally concealed that every year around 100 million people from previous births become capable of procreation again, who then of course also produce offspring, whether intentionally or unintentionally, in addition to those who are conceived and brought into the world by the already existing world population. So every year many millions of new progeny are added to the already existing offspring-producing mass, followed by the already for years procreative and offspring creating year after year accumulating. So the otherwise already unreasonably conceived masses of descendants are annually still increased by the new procreative capable, which however is not seized with the statisticians, and thus the mankind is lied regarding the population growth. Nor is the mortality rate in the entire earthly population able to reduce the excess of the Earth's population and, in connection with the huge birth rate, not to reduce it to such an extent that the overpopulation would decrease in number. Conversely, it is growing at an increasing rate. And as overpopulation increases, the resulting problems and destruction of nature, fauna and flora, the seas and fresh waters, the environment, the climate and the planet itself become greater and more violent. The overpopulation of the masses requires a variety of measures which inevitably have an overall impact on the planet, its nature, fauna and flora, forests, waters of all kinds, the atmosphere, the climate and the environment, which are all negative and destructive. And this is a fact which is neither seen nor understood by the so-called professionals of environmental protection nor by politicians, rulers and earthlings themselves, because all of them go blindly and stupidly through the world, and neither can recognize nor want to understand that it is just all machinations which emanate from the overpopulation, which destroy everything all around and cause immense catastrophes of all kinds, including the immense natural catastrophes. To these catastrophes belong also diseases and epidemics, which will spread in the future more and more, whereby various from Africa, Arabia, Asia, South America and from the USA coming also more and more will creep into Europe and will bring themselves extending much disaster and death. Also forest fires in various countries belong to it, which rage again and again since years in the USA and demand human lives, as also in other countries, whereby also many houses burn and innumerable wild animals die thereby. And this only because of the irresponsible machinations of the overpopulation, because residential buildings are put into the forests, which go up in flames by lightning strikes or malicious arson, and from which enormous bush and forest fires develop. Also fertile land is built with houses and factories, with sales centers, sports facilities, roads, paths and airfields etc., as necessary machinations for the needs of the inexorably growing overpopulation. But also the overpopulation-related machinations are to be mentioned, which are accomplished in relation to sport possibilities for the crowds of the overpopulation. In the foreground are all vehicles powered by explosion engines, airplanes, helicopters, ships, cars, motorcycles and other vehicles of all kinds, which are used senselessly and irresponsibly for sports events such as races etc., but which not only pollute the atmosphere and air, but also impair the climate, destroy its normal course, and through the toxic exhaust fumes also impair the health of earthlings and all other life forms dangerous to life. This is in addition to the fact that the majority of the entire agricultural and horticultural enterprises produce enormous tonnages of diverse and life-threatening toxic substances, which cause diseases and epidemics in all forms of fauna and flora as well as in humans, whereby many people die from developing diseases as a result of poisons produced in this way, as do plants, animals, birds, fish, insects and all other forms of life, which are ultimately completely exterminated. All these present and future events and machinations, which have resulted from the overpopulation since long ago and also today and in the future continue to run, I have already mentioned in the 1940s and 1950s openly and sent in writing also to many newspapers and radio stations all over the world, which remained however all around without resonance and was never published. And even today, when all my predictions come true, which I had described in many different ways, partly more than 70 years ago and also later again and again in many ways, and which I still call and disseminate today, neither a newspaper nor a journal, television or radio station cares about it, but on the contrary I am as ever only laughed at and insulted as a do-gooder, weirdo, madman and sectarian. Neither honest and good journalists, nor politicians, nor rulers, let alone people from the populations want to hear the reality and its truth, but in the old scourge of the slow, but continuous, inexorable and inevitable destruction and annihilation of all life, of nature, its fauna and flora, as well as of the atmosphere, climate, planets and the environment as a whole, continue thoughtlessly and completely irresponsibly and let the catastrophe that inevitably results from it become reality. This in this way, while the politicians and rulers as well as other responsible persons of the states waste the tax money senselessly, to which the majority of the stupid ones from the population still screams pro and hooray. And that also from this consequence the upper elites of the state conducting powerful do not have to live in poverty and can live in joy and glory from the taxpayers' money of the working classes. They take care of it in the way that they harass, exploit and bring the populations with still more tax levies for all possible and impossible things to the hungry cloth. But everything comes much worse, because according to foresight and future probability calculations from the 1940s and 1950s, since 2011 the time has been running for hundreds and thousands of abuse schemes to be uncovered worldwide with regard to sexual abuse of children and adolescents, as well as rapes of nuns, mostly by Catholic clergymen or priests, bishops, cardinals and other dignitaries in the name of Christ. But to these religious sectarian fallible sex abuse monsters of Christ's grace belong also other evildoers from the economy and the population, like leaders, group leaders that is coaches that is leaders and leaders etc., who treat, train or teach for example individuals in various things, like concerning health promotion, like for example physiotherapy, psychology, psychiatry etc. The same applies to life support, school lessons, all kinds of vocational schools, domestic help, sports teams, language and music schools, etc. Both minors and adults under guardianship are looked after, sexually abused and raped, forced into prostitution, tortured, enslaved, exploited and ultimately mercilessly murdered. But all this is only a small part of the whole of all misery and vehement violence as well as of all manifold violent degenerations, which from now on spread more and more degenerately in humanity on earth and also increase in a criminal, terrorist and warlike way to heights never seen before. Peace, lack of freedom and injustice will become the order of the day and jurisdictions will become henchmen of the discrimination of the law. And peacelessness, freedom-cutting as well as strife, hatred, maltreatment, brawls and malicious violence up to and including murder are becoming more and more prevalent in families, friendships and acquaintances, in groups and in humanity in general, as a result of the further uncontrolled prevalence of the overpopulation of the world and its constantly precarious machinations contemptuous of humanity and life. Families are increasingly terrorized by their own members, and family members, especially children and adolescents, are sexually abused and raped by their own family members, such as father, mother and siblings or relatives, but murdered as a result of fear, jealousy, hatred or for money or other material values. Human unattachment, mercilessness, disregard for fellow human beings, nature and its fauna and flora, and the general indifference associated with it and directed against everything drives earthly humanity into an unparalleled degeneration and into a chaos of its own moral devaluation and depravity. And here the religious sectarian faith plays an exceptionally large and unsurpassed role, because it completely suppresses every spark of intellect, reason and intelligence in the believing human being, and thus prevents every independent recognition of the effective real reality and its irrevocable truth, as well as every independent thought with regard to the truth of reality, every consideration and creation of one's own formation of opinion in accordance with the truth of reality. The religious sectarian faith of man creates in him more and more confusion with regard to his religiously prejudiced consciousness, intellect, reason and justice, as well as his false moral and unrighteous attitude. Therefore, all his senses in this regard become more and more vehemently flaring up degenerations. These, however, produce ever more increasing fear, evil hatred, boundless peacelessness, bondage, jealousy and uncontrollable violent violence, which spreads more and more all around, spreads to our fellow human beings and carries countless with it and leads to murder and manslaughter, to massacres and again, as since time immemorial, to renewed acts of war and terror. And all of this can no longer be controlled, neither by the individual himself, nor by the governments and their forces of law and order, etc. And from this point of view everything follows in every conceivable relationship with the inexorably progressing electronic technical development, and the populations are spied on in every way, and ultimately inevitably totally monitored. This is in addition to the fact that the ever-increasing development of ultra-fine electronics technology will unfold in such a way that the entire human race will become hopelessly dependent on it and will ultimately be hopelessly controlled by it. Already today it is so far that innumerable earthlings of the already far developed electronic technology are so decayed, also all companies of all kinds, all governments, offices, armies, hospitals and service enterprises etc., that already at the present time immense disasters happen, even if only to a small part or failure of the in this connection existing technologies occurs. And if something like this happens on a larger scale, then there is hardly any rescue left. And already it is also the case that already today with certain catastrophes, as with forest fires, despite the existing technology, not much can be done to save much, as it will be again and again in California, as it will be again and again, where far more than 1,000 people will die, as you've said recently, even if it is first assumed that there will be only a few dead. And that so many people will die in the fire. How did you say that in several areas of California there will be a catastrophe, with the forest fire raging and the celebrity stronghold of Malibu being razed to the ground by the flames, as will happen in Paradise and other areas, as your predictive apparatus has shown, that this is solely the fault of the overpopulation, because more and more irresponsibly fertile land and healthy forests are being built up as a result of the masses of people, as I said myself. And if I look at the whole thing, it will be even worse in the future, because the 100 million or so people who populate the Earth more and more every year create even more disaster and destruction on the planet, whose nature and fauna and flora, than they are ultimately able to cope with. Ultimately a natural collapse will be inevitable. For California, the whole of this coming catastrophe will on the one hand be one of historical proportions, because according to your words, everything in Malibu and Paradise will burn to the ground and destroy everything far away, but only the overpopulation machinations can be considered authors, as you yourself mentioned. I too wrote about these enormous fires in the USA in the 1940s and 1950s, when the Earth's population was only 2.5 billion people at that time, in contrast to today, when it is almost 9 billion, and in only 70 years, as I said before. And the fact that humanity on Earth continues to grow rapidly and that through its machinations of all kinds, because it needs more and more food and daily material, medical and other necessities, housing opportunities, means of transport and many other things, it creates even more insoluble problems, destroys even more, causes catastrophes and destroys and exterminates plants as well as wildlife forms. Everything only gets worse. But all those responsible in politics and governments, environmental organizations, know-it-alls, world improvement phantoms, scientists and other big mouths have no idea what really to do, namely a worldwide rigorous birth ban for 7 years, and then a worldwide controlled birth control with a birth rate that has to be adhered to exactly. But instead of all the big mouths, the leaders of the world, the politicians and rulers, in cooperation with their peoples, being anxious to decide on and implement these most urgently needed measures, they are only lazing around with stupid palaveries and behaving like underage children, leading a childish, illogical babble, because in their immaturity they lack on the one hand the intellect and reason to work out thoroughly thought-out opportune solutions and measures. But since worldwide for the majority of all politicians, rulers, responsible organizations, religions and sects, as well as quite obviously for the great majority of mankind his intelligence is only sufficient, due to his manifold delusion of faith, to talk idle nonsense, although they all boast on the one hand to be human, nature-friendly, life-affirming and intelligent, they are in truth on the other hand incapable of perceiving the real reality and the truth visible therein. As a result, it is absolutely impossible for them to make themselves even a touch of a valuable thought about the authenticity, irrefutability of reality and its reliability as well as the resulting truth and incontestable authenticity and security. So, all over the world, hop and malt have been lost to the majority of politicians and rulers, as well as to the great majority of all peoples, who have fallen faithfully and in bondage to the majority of foolish, ignorant and incompetent politicians and rulers, as well as to preachers of religions and sects, etc., and no help can be expected from reason and reason. So all of them cannot be expected to do what is necessary to stop and regulate births, nor to put an end to and stop all destruction of nature, the climate and the destruction and extermination of fauna and flora. As a result, it is not possible that of these two great things ever what would be necessary to do that all life of nature and its fauna and flora can be preserved, which ultimately includes human life with a healthy and planet and nature-suitable population, which will cause the downfall of mankind in today's and further inexorably growing masses, which can only be avoided if finally with reason and intelligence the responsibility is seized and necessarily properly and adequately acted.
And since you now openly name these facts, which effectively correspond to reality and truth, as you have also called them as such, you will be maliciously attacked and condemned by all the mistakes you have mentioned, because they neither want to acknowledge nor hear reality nor truth, because they do not recognize themselves in their fallibility and self-assertiveness, nor feel attacked in their egoism and arrogance, nor want to recognize themselves as victims of their own degenerations. Only those earthlings who are accessible to the mind and reason, and who are not lacking in intelligence, will be on your side and join the mission and thus the truths of life. For those who are without mind, reason and intelligence will, as since time immemorial, stay away from the effective truth and remain addicted to their religious, sectarian and falsely philosophical faith, as well as to false and deceitful political and governmental populism. Thus they testify to themselves as being addicted to stupidity, as they are needed, as being in ignorance and in lack of understanding and reason as well as in intelligence poverty.
There is no doubt about that for me. But there is another reason why these kinds of earthlings are absolute failure in their irrational behavior and in their disregard and concealment of predictions as human beings and can only spit big tones.
Unreasonable behavior and the concealment of predictions towards our peoples are absolutely alien to us Plejarians, but I don't have to explain it in detail. Otherwise, however, I have something to say that I have to observe again and again in people on Earth and make them complain. This is the excessive, superfluous and overflowing speech in relation to excessive and meaningless statements and explanations, as well as in relation to complaints and misconduct etc. in relation to any things and facts, whereby the speakers do not perceive how they burden the audience with them and impair their interest and attention. But because those who speak in this way are trapped in their desire to listen to themselves and thus consciously or unconsciously rise above those who are addressed and who feel harassed by the ranting of words, their listening and also their thinking disappears very quickly, also because their interest is destroyed by the ranting of the speakers. These terrestrial men who engage in such a ranting are so impressed by their own voice and their almost endless ranting themselves that they are unable to control their ranting, which is why they make no effort to say, explain, object to, or correct what is necessary in short words or in a short speech. In addition, however, there are various aspects that must also be mentioned in principle, such as that if rules, orders, ordinances, laws and agreements etc. exist, these may not simply be stubbornly enforced in a fixed manner, but what is very often attempted or done in this way, whereby from this behavior usually inevitably a, as you call it, paragraph writing arises, which can or may not be attributed any exception, change or special status. And in this way it results then that the fulfillment of a paragraph, or several of them, the whole becomes the absolute, the must and thus the work, and therefore also in special situations neither necessary changes, omissions, innovations or adaptations etc. are taken into consideration, but are tried to enforce vehemently and violently the paragraph reiterate, that is the paragraphs and the laws, regulations, orders, agreements and rules etc. But this means that things, facts, occurrences and situations that are different in their nature in every case, and exclusively always different or different, and are never identical in all nuances, and cannot be defined in the same way, are always judged and handled in the same way. This, however, is fundamentally wrong on the one hand, and unfair on the other in a way that testifies to the fact that people who direct their thoughts, feelings, actions and behavior in this way are absolutely incapable of making judgments and determinations in such matters and things in a righteous manner. People who are affected in this way are also unable to perform actions that require necessary changes, adaptations and extensions or reductions of existing rules, decisions, laws and regulations as well as behaviors, because they are subject to a paragraph phantasm and are neither able to recognize nor comprehend nor understand that in certain situations regarding decisions, rules, laws and regulations etc., they are not able to perform actions that require necessary changes, adaptations and extensions or reductions of existing rules, decisions, laws and regulations as well as behaviors. Forbearance is exercised in necessarily mitigating or simply an adaptive change must be captured and determined within a possible framework. So the people who think and act in this way, which is already taught by the early circumstances of life in the wrong way by the persons concerned themselves, have to free themselves in a due way from their wrong judgments and wrong actions and turn to the logic or consistency of reasonable and just judgment, decision, action and behavior. But this is difficult for the Earth people because they first have to admit their wrong behavior, which as a rule, according to their misunderstood view of self-righteousness, goes against their sense, whereby they feel affected by self-pity and thoughtlessness and behave unreasonably and rejectingly, clinging to the old patterns, which they do not give up as a result of paragraph rhetoric and do not want to change or lead to the better by means of innovations or reason. So no necessary changes are taken into consideration either, but stubbornly adhere to the traditional and prevent any progress for the better and good in the future, for which also unconsidered unfair aspects are cited, that the same right applies to all and must therefore be guaranteed, that no necessary exceptions must be made, but that all must be categorized equally into the same duties, rights and orders. But this is fundamentally wrong, inhumane, unjust and destructive, in every family and community, as well as in every group in every people, which is why everything must always be handled and judged according to a given situation and thing, and why everything must never be judged, decided and handled equally in all situations, and in one or the other thing. Every situation, thing and circumstance requires separate decisions, actions and behaviors, etc., such as any offender who has committed exactly the same offense as another, must be judged, punished and treated according to his personal circumstances, his behavior, his distress and various other factors. If we take a closer look at this, we can also see that completely different and pertinent orders, duties and behavior must be taken into consideration and applied if any things, situations or occurrences arise which require exceptions in a fixed order or any other necessary change, such as, for example, a change in the order in which the person is to be treated. B. In the case of essential fulfillment of the obligation to work, which arises and must be carried out for reasons of personal or community safety, or which concerns the daily necessities of life in relation to all necessities such as food, housing, insurance and means of transport, etc. Other than that, however, there are also inevitabilities to be mentioned in this regard, which must inevitably be regulated by changes or exceptions, and which must also never be rejected, such as illness or accident, as well as mothers who have given birth, or with infants who are already alive and who still require direct maternal care, and consequently necessary exceptions and changes must be taken into consideration and granted, even if certain rules have been adopted and given. In any case, a decided rule never means a compulsion, nor any violence, and above all never a use of paragraph writing, whereby such a rule has been the worst means of destroying peace, freedom and justice from time immemorial anyway, and it continues to be and must never be used. Of course, in every human community there must be orders, laws and decrees as well as ordinances, thus also rules, but all these must never be absolutely unalterable, but must always be adaptable to every conceivable situation and thing, etc., so that they may never be acted upon exactly according to a decided paragraph, but must each be variable depending on the situation and thing. Moreover, a rule is not an absolutely fixed order, but a factor of a general, special, but simple, not difficult and not absolutely fixed, not strictly observable guideline, which without exception embodies only the customary in the customary, but allows exceptions. A rule is not a law, because such a rule corresponds to an unchangeable right of every company, or the right of the company itself, so the law is according to the law the right itself, consequently also power of the law. The jurisdiction is exercised unchangeably, whereby, however, rules are introduced which, depending on the case, judge the same and the same thing according to its circumstances or according to given special facts. This is in contrast to the rule, which is derived from certain time-related and changeable regularities, which are gained from experience and knowledge, and which are defined in agreement with the parties concerned as a time-related directive which is binding for a certain area, with the possibility of necessary exceptions and amendments. Also in this respect, as everywhere else, a paragraph rhetoric is not appropriate, but creating discord, lack of freedom and injustice, and thus destroying it. And if complaints are also included and polemizations are raised and endless and senseless complacent rantings are led, then everything quickly leads to disinterest of the audience, because every polemization and every ranting is usually understood as aggressiveness and therefore rejected, as well as hostility and rejection arise from it. People who demand the strict and unalterable observance and fulfillment of paragraphs, rules, order, law or conduct or anything else, in which they make, read and present a speech, complaint, demand, regulation or statement, etc., in a flurry of words or polemic and dominant manner, suffer from a morbid obsession. Such a one gives them resistance to reason, and reason that in any case adherence to paragraphs must take place without any pardon and without possibility of unnecessary change. In this way, an undisguised domination also pushes into the foreground, whereby however the person concerned, who is infested by these degenerations, does not perceive this in any way. Nor does such a person recognize neither his obsession nor his dominance, and thus also not the fact, because he is not aware of his selfish misconduct, that his flood of words harasses those who have to listen in such a way, as I have already explained before, that they lose their interest and attention in the matter to be discussed or simply presented, do not really listen, and even misunderstand everything, and consequently misinterpret everything, as clerks then also misrepresent it in their annals. But the whole thing also leads to an individual's rush of speeches animating and seducing the audience to the fact that statements and speeches of other persons, who present their statements, presentations and speeches etc. in a reasonable short framework with words, speeches, presentations and explanations, are also perceived as annoying, and therefore their statements are not comprehensively grasped but only halfway understood and misinterpreted. In this respect, there is also the inevitable factor that, as a result of the audience being harassed by a flood of words or polemicization etc. of an unobjective, unnecessary and meaningless, endlessly speaking person, the listeners not only feel very harassed and fall into inattention, but also become incapable of remembering, and thus remembering the contents of their flood of words and polemicization by Plejaren, note Billy, equals harassing. This inevitably leads to a situation in which once decided and determined rushes of words and polemics of speakers etc. cause a profound lack of attention and harassment among the audience, whereby the memory of the whole is extinguished before it can establish itself in the memory as a reminiscence, and thus as a memory performance or ability to remember. And this in turn leads to the fact that when reference is made to certain decisions, incidents, events and situations, etc., which have been taken, decided and determined, etc., there is no memory of them, and it is often claimed that such things never happened, etc.
What you're saying is all very clear to me, but not to the people of this world. So many people who have responsibilities in these directions you've mentioned, who are not aware in any way that they're completely wrong, and that they're even acting against the natural creative laws. And they do this because they have yet to learn everything in relation to the whole thing, which is, on the one hand, extremely laborious for them, but on the other hand they also have yet to be taught, because they still have no or only very little knowledge of what corresponds to correctness and what corresponds to falsehood in relation to the facts you have mentioned.
That is correct, but no excuse, because understanding, reason and intelligence are in all those earth people who are not in any way hindered in their consciousness, but are normal, as you like to say, are in every respect responsible for everything and each of their thoughts, feelings, actions and behaviors. And this is also determining in this way when they have no knowledge of any things and facts etc., because the responsibility already begins where ideas and thoughts arise. Once these ideas and thoughts have arisen, they lead to further reflection, and thus also to the perception of reality and truth in free nature, the entire environment of humanity and all living beings of every species and species, from which, with sufficient and well thought out thinking and reasoning, etc., the natural creative laws can be recognized and the right insights and conclusions drawn, applied and understood in life through understanding, reason, action and behavior.
Of course, this is clear and cannot be refuted. But the whole thing requires a long training course, which we cannot simply deal with in our conversation, which is why I think that we will leave this topic alone. So I want to point out that recently in a private conversation it was said that the US presidential Trump is not simply stupid, but pathologically stupid, and also does not notice how he is badly influenced and abused in many things by his false advisors and other surrounding, advisors, and vassals who influence him. This is especially the case in relation to Russia, because in this respect Trump is influenced in a unipolar and inflammatory way against Russia by his surrounding anti-Russian consultants, which he does not realize in his stupidity.
That's true, because Trump is influenced all around, both in relation to Russia and equally in relation to China and other states of the world, in such a way that the USA are those states which alone are capable of unipolar leadership. In his stupidity and arrogance, Trump is increasingly degenerating into a more and more widespread form, attacking anything and everything he does not like in other countries, disrupting and destroying established contractual orders and agreements through false accusations, and also dissolving important treaties in order to enforce his America First in his confused sense. In doing so, he is also mistaken in the hope and belief that the whole American people will thank him for this. But this is not the case, because despite his submissive followers, there are also many clear thinkers and sensible people who oppose his and his false advisors and vassals and unreasonable and hate-driving machinations with regard to hostility towards Russia, war, contempt for humanity, hegemony and disorder. It will come, however, that unneeded and irrational Trump maniacs will also viciously resort to dangerous acts of violence and treacherous attacks in order to infamously and insidiously take action against persons who do not agree with Trump's machinations, to object to his confused actions and, consequently, to be eliminated. So people are to be harmed who publicly intervene against Trump's unfair and completely hostile machinations. The fact is that Trump, in his paranoid state and in his state of ignorance and unreason, has a large degree of negative brain organic changes, which is why he not only organizes confused cross-drifts worldwide, but also builds up, arranges and stages malicious intrigues in order to be able to realize his election plans of his America First. But the fact that he also endangers the security of the USA and the states of Asia and Europe, and ultimately the dangerously shaky and dubious calm of the whole world, which suddenly explodes and can lead to a nuclear war, is something neither Trump nor his consultants misleading him and all those who negatively influence and support him in the hegemonic frenzy can grasp. All advisers and other vassals who are ill with the same delusion and accompany his confused ideas are not able to judge what they conjure up with their irresponsible actions, let alone understand which misfortune which encompasses the world and mankind can arise from their delusional thinking and acting. Also that through the madness of the now overlying hostility towards Russia in the US government, as well as in that part of the US American population, any peace efforts are counteracted, which Russia since time immemorial, and also in today's time the Russian people, and especially President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin are striving for, that does not bother all the fallible hostile towards peace in the government circles and in the part of the like-minded of the people in the United States of America. This, while in contrast, that minority of the US population with a strong sense of reason is harassed and insulted as a traitor who desires peace, freedom and justice as well as a conciliatory and social or accommodating relationship with Russia that is ready and willing to make peaceful concessions. But the majority of the US government and US military as well as the US secret services, above all the CIA, but also the unneeded part of the anti-Russian US population, do not care about it. And this carelessness also refers to the fact that Russia sees itself forced to go it alone with China, Syria, Turkey and Persia, etc., in order to do so. It is not the case that Russia will be forced to enter into relations with China, Syria, Turkey and Persia, etc., instead of these being established in cooperation with the USA and all the other states in the world being included, thereby creating a start for world peace. But this will fail, as it has always failed due to the hegemonic mania of the USA, which will result in China and Japan, in spite of the old hostility from war times, also endeavoring to rapprochement in peace with each other again and possibly ultimately forming a unity against the hegemonic ambitions of the USA and defending themselves against them. But the power-obsessed and Russia-hostile statesmen of the USA, at present on the front line the Trump, which has fallen into pathological stupidity, his false advisers and the whole elitist vassalry cheering for him, as well as the unneeded Russia-hostile part of the US population, are neither interested in peace, freedom nor justice in the world, but on the contrary only in their measures.